Welcome to the Archetypal Mosaic. This is Mikhail Tank. On the phone, I have two very powerful people with very powerful stories, both from the Japanese American Museum of San Jose. Gordon Smith, the lead docent, and Yoshiko Kanazawa, also a docent, who actually was a young girl at the time of her family's internment in the concentration camps in the United States. Welcome to the Archetypal Mosaic.
Thank you for the introduction.
Thank you. Let us begin with you, Yoshiko. How old were you when everything happened? If you can tell the audience what happened to you as a young girl.
Okay, I was in the first grade, and I was about 6.5 when all this happened. It was a very traumatic time for our family because all of a sudden we were told we had to leave and we couldn't take everything with us. Fortunately, my father was a gardener and he had a lot of wealthy clients who had large homes, and we could store many of our things with those people. So we didn't have to sell off our belongings like everyone else had to do who wasn't quite as fortunate. I remember being in school where we had drills where we went under our desk in preparation for, in case we were bombed while we were at school. We all had to take a blanket to school. I also remember going to a friend's birthday party and my mother coming to pick me up early because I had to be in by the 6 o'clock curfew. So even if I was a little girl, it was a frightening situation for me.
Tell me, when you found out that this was going to happen, how was the news delivered to you?
Well, at first, Pearl Harbor was bombed. And on that morning, my family has often told me the story of how my oldest sister went out to tell my dad that the Japanese are bombing Pearl Harbor. My father didn't believe it, so he just kept on working outside. And my sister went into the house, heard more, went out to get my dad, and he came into the house. And he told us it might be dangerous for us because the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. Now, we didn't find out about Executive Order 9066. Well, that happened on February 19. And there were notices put up all over the town. We still have copies of those notices that went up in places where Japanese congregated. So we didn't get a special letter saying you will be moved, but we were just told by these posters that everyone had to report to the families had to report to a certain place on a certain date. And then my father told us what had happened. When he went to sign us up, we were all given a family number. My number was 23237. It's a number that I always remember. It stays with me.
Tell me, 23237. This was your number. Now, tell me, at this time when these posters were out and your father, told the family where the family should meet, the idea that young girls and women who had absolutely nothing to do with any part of the war or anything of the nature were simply because of fear and racism from the United States, they put you in these camps. How do you forgive that? Can you forgive that? How do you process something like that?
In my family and in many families, the parents had come from Japan. They were not citizens. They were not allowed to be citizens. And so they felt they couldn't really fight this. Most of the families felt like, we'll just obey what the government is saying. Some people felt like if we obeyed, we were helping the American cause. We weren't creating extra problems for the government. There were other people who felt like they should not be taken away like this. And they were brave people too, because they were ostracized by the whole community who was saying, let's just cooperate. Well, there were certain people like Fred Kuramatsu and Gordon who said, no, this is not right. We're American citizens. This should not be happening to us. But as a 6-year-old, I just went along with my family.
I understand. Tell me a little bit from their perspective, if you can. When you said they were ostracized by both the Americans and the Japanese who wanted to cooperate, how do you think that they, who had their honor, and they felt like they were being deeply mistreated by the country for absolutely no reason other than the fact that they were Japanese Americans, and just thrown into this cauldron of fear. How could they psychologically, spiritually deal with such abuse?
Well, of course, I was a child,
right.
And so for me, I had my family around me, and things did become slightly normal when we had our schools in camp. We were able to go to church in camp. And then my father became a cook in the camp, and we ate at the dining room where he cooked. So we were eating my father's food.
Okay.
So there were some things that were normal for us. I think for the older people, I think of the people who became my in-laws later. They were both born, my husband's parents were both born in the United States, and they felt like they had to stand up for certain rights. So my mother-in-law especially formed a women's group in her camp in Colorado, and she organized the women to write down all the things that were not being done properly in a humane way. And she did get the government to change some of what they were doing. Like we had communal showers and toilets. The toilets were not divided into sections. They were just seats all in a row. She insisted that partitions be put up.
That's powerful that your mother stood up in such a way to give as simple respects of humanity, which weren't even provided. Let me ask you this. Right. Clarify this for me. Did you have to give up your house, your dwelling, completely?
Okay, for my family, we were renting a house.
Okay. And
so, yes, we had to empty it all out. And actually, our landlord had told my dad, you could keep some of your things in my storage area, because then, like your truck, you could use until the very last minute then. My dad did that, and when we came out of the camp, my dad went to get his truck. The tires were gone. A lot of the parts from the motor were gone. And the landlord said, I'm really sorry. I didn't think you were going to come back. So I used what I needed. And
so the landlord assumed that it was a potential reality that people would be killed at the concentration camps.
possibly. He just thought we would not ever come back.
What about people who did have houses?
Okay, now my husband's family did have a house, and they rented it out. They got a friend to take care of collecting the rent and taking care of any problems that might come up. So they saved their house. Some people did have to sell them off, but they were fortunate enough to keep theirs.
How much time between the posters, the statement of where people have to go, and the actual moving, how much time was given?
For us, it was a couple of months. But there were people on certain strategic areas where they were given 24 hours.
Wow.
That was a fishing area near San Pedro in California.
It was a settlement called Terminal Island,
Yes.
which was a settlement of Japanese immigrant fishermen near Los Angeles.
And what was the reason why they were given 24 hours?
The government felt that...
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Yoshiko.
No, please go ahead, Gordon.
The government felt that since these fishermen had boats that could go out on the ocean, that they could be supplying fuel oil to Japanese submarines or using shortwave radios to communicate with the Japanese Navy. And so they were believed to be an imminent hazard.
Gordon, what percentage of that was accurate to the percentage that was just fear-based?
Oh, it was all 100% fear-based. There was never any evidence that there were shortwave communications with the Japanese military or that they had provided any fuel oil. There was one instance where I recall, I think it was an FBI agent that demanded to know what those 55-gallon drums were on one of those Japanese fishing boats. And the fisherman told him those were the drums with which they held the chum, the bait that they used for fishing. But
Gordon, tell me, the question I asked Yoshiko, in terms of the tremendous, this is a two-part question for you. Those who said this is horribly unfair and we want to stand up to this, and they were even ostracized by their own people, including the country, what kind of convoluted thing is that, where you can't even have your ability to stand up for your honor? How did those people, how did they survive psychologically afterwards? Were they forever kind of wounded spiritually, or do you think that they were able to forgive, or were they given any kind of compensation?
So let me answer that by saying, there were nearly 120,000 people who were incarcerated. And so clearly the experiences and the feelings varied widely. So, you had some that felt this was a way to show patriotism. You had others who believed this was a total affront to civil rights. And their experiences after the war, I think, also varied widely. In some communities and families, just reconciliation. But in other places, there were still disagreements between people who believed it had been the patriotic thing to do and those who felt this was an abrogation of civil rights. So there isn't a simple, clear answer to that question.
But for those who felt and were correct in that it was a violation of civil human rights, how did they get through this?
Well, there's a couple of cases where they filed lawsuits against the removal. Fred Korematsu, who's quite a famous civil rights individual for the internment, filed his own court case. And lastly, there was a lady, Mitsui Endo, who filed a lawsuit. All four ended up at the U.S. Supreme Court.
Did any of them win anything? Did any of them succeed?
This is one of the great ironies of the four Supreme Court decisions. In three of the decisions, the earliest ones, Supreme Court held that the removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast was constitutional. However, in the last case, the Mitsui Endo case, the Supreme Court ruled it was not constitutional to keep them in camps.
So
it was. Go ahead.
Well, are you saying that it was constitutional to remove them, but not constitutional to keep them? Is pretty much what the consensus was?
Yes, that's correct.
Which, of course, makes no sense, right?
Which makes no sense. And by the time the last Supreme Court decision had come out, this was December 1944, it was clear that the Japanese military were going to be defeated. And so at that point, January 1st, 1945, people were allowed to start leaving camp.
If things turned otherwise, if the Japanese won, let's say, or if the history went otherwise, do you think that the people in the American Japanese who were in the concentration camps, do you think they would be used as sacrificial lambs at that point? Was it kind of like, let's keep them here to see what happens, and if we lose, we're going to sacrifice these people? What was the thinking, do you think, what were they intentioning to do?
I don't have much insight into what the real thoughts of the government were. I think if whatever thoughts they had, they kept that very close. Mm-hmm. However, at least the stated reason for removing the Japanese from the West Coast mm-hmm. was that there was fear that Japan would invade the West Coast. Mm-hmm. And then the Japanese living on the West Coast would rise up and support the invasion through espionage, through sabotage. And so they had to be removed from the West Coast to camps inland so they could not support the military invasion.
Amazing. So in a way, the Supreme Court found it constitutional on the basis simply of fear to pretty much destroy people's lives.
I think for the Supreme Court justices, the thinking was more that the stated military necessity mm-hmm. of removing the Japanese Americans mm-hmm. because of this fear of the invasion, mm-hmm. that was sufficient to constitutionally remove them from the West Coast.
Tell me, what's happening now with which is a totally different situation, but also not a different situation. There's a lot of, ongoing hate against Asian Americans in this country. These things are, both not related and very much related. Where do you see a connection about how, again, in America, which is supposed to be a free country, out of fear, you throw people into a camp. Out of fear, you hurt somebody on the street. How does that work in a country like this? And what do you do about something like that? That's so kind of inappropriate.
Let me comment on that. Mm-hmm. During the years after I came out of the camp, I always felt like a second-class citizen. I always felt that if anything went wrong, if the Japanese in Japan did something that the people here objected to, that we would be blamed again.
Exactly.
Now, right after I came out of the camp, I was only 11 years old, and some woman told me, go back where you came from. When the Japanese auto industry started growing and taking over first place from Detroit, there was anti-Japanese feeling again. And I was told on the street by a bunch of young kids, go back where you came from. And so I've known that whenever something happens, we can be blamed again. And so when our president started talking about the Kung flu, the Chinese virus, I thought this is going to happen again. I didn't think it would happen to the extent it has. And so now young people are standing up. People are standing up and saying, this is not right. This anti.
What you said is so valuable in the sense that you felt like if something that you were a representative, an unelected representative of Japan, simply because you're in this country. So in this country, which is a melting pot, there's a lot of loss of identity and culture, and that, I believe, creates a lot of racism and is the cause of it. But people who do have identity and culture, such as yourself and such as myself, since we both come from other countries, we happen to become these unelected representatives of the countries, and then people project their feelings onto us and behave towards us in a way which they think, is a way to express themselves, which is very negative, of course, to put all this hate on us. And you're saying that you feel that at any point you could have been the subject again and again, and that you were a second-class citizen. Do you still feel that way?
I'm trying not to. I don't. But I feel very happy that I have a place like the Japanese American Museum to speak to young people and to older people who didn't know anything about people like us being sent to those camps. Yeah. So I feel good about sharing that story so that everyone will know what happened, and maybe that'll begin affecting the population here.
A few more questions, of course. Who made the decision in the government to do this? Do you guys know?
Well, the decision was made by President Franklin Roosevelt. Yoshiko had mentioned Executive Order 9066, which came out on February the 19th of 1942. Interestingly, you read the order, the word Japanese does not appear in the order. The order authorized the military to set up what they called exclusion zones and remove anybody that they thought was a military security threat. But the order was clearly directed against Japanese Americans. So they're the ones that got the posters put up.
And then when the posters were put up, did they state Japanese Americans, or were they specifically placed in Japanese American locations?
Those did say Japanese American.
Did anybody else? Yes.
Just a quick insert here. The posters actually were directed to people of Japanese ancestry. So this ensured it wasn't just the Japanese who had immigrated from Japan who could not become U.S. citizens, but also included their U.S.-born, U.S. citizen children and grandchildren.
Unbelievable. And when this Order 9066, executive order, which didn't specify Japanese or Japanese Americans, but the posters did, was anybody else also placed into these camps aside from Japanese and Japanese Americans?
There were a few Germans and a few Italians who were placed in some kind of camps, government, Department of Justice camps.
Gordon, do you have one of those posters in the museum?
Yes, well, reproduction. Yes, we have reproductions in the museum.
Yoshiko, how was the treatment? First of all, how long were you there altogether, and how was the treatment compared to, let's say, living with your family?
The people in the camps, well, we were all alike. We were in the same boat. We were treated well. Is that what you're asking me? How the people in the camps treated?
Not to each other, not your neighbors, but the guards, or what were the people called who were overseeing the camps?
The top administrators were Caucasian, but the block managers were Japanese Americans or Japanese, and we all tried to treat each other well. We had a lot of benefits too, because anyone who had any kind of special talent would have classes in piano playing or modern dance or artwork. So there were things for us to do. We weren't treated like the Germans treated the Jewish people.
Which is my right. Which is my family actually. I lost 157 people by the German Nazis. Yeah.
Oh.
Let me ask you this. I went to the museum once. And it was a beautiful museum, and I saw the small either they were reproductions or they were actually parts of the bedding or the locations where people slept. They were very small, right?
Yes. It was basically like having. Well, my family we were a family of 8, and we had a room that was probably 40 by 20. And there was no running water, so you had to go use the communal bathrooms and the communal showers. And we had very little electricity, so there wasn't a lot of light that you could read by. It was a difficult situation, but I think the families did so well. People like my parents taught us about they use the word gaman. It's a Japanese word. And it means to persevere with dignity. And that's what we tried to do. And ganbare means hang in there, and shikata ga nai means it can't be helped, so just make the best of it.
And that's what I was going to ask you also, is about your exceptionally positive attitude, which is, of course, the will, it lights the way for life to continue. You almost answered it in these powerful words, gaman, to persevere. What about you? I mean, you're obviously a very positive person who is able to see things in a good way in order to survive and enjoy your life. What is the key to that positivity for those who maybe are not able to connect to it internally?
For me, it's part what I've learned through Christianity, but a part of it is what my parents taught me about Buddhism. And I studied tea ceremony, where harmony and purity and respect and tranquility are so important. And when we came back, we were able to go to college and get good jobs and continue our lives. So my husband and I had decided, let's just put this camp experience behind us. We're being accepted now. We have a good life. Let's just move on. And I did that for 50 years. And then after he died, I thought, I think I do want to speak up about this a little bit. And so I went to the museum, and Gordon got me working as a docent. And I'm so happy I can tell my story now. But people always tell me, you have such a positive outlook. Well, I think because I have had a good life too, despite the experiences I had when I was a little girl.
How long were you in the internment camp for in total? And the other question is, you mentioned there was no running water and very little electricity. I want to clarify that it's very different from the rental house where you were before that, where you did have running water and you did have electricity. So the conditions were severely lower in the camps from your rental location.
Yes, they were. Something, Mikhail, that I remember is when we were first released from the camps, and we went by bus to Phoenix, and at Phoenix we were supposed to catch a train to go back to Pasadena, and there was a counter there where we could order whatever we wanted, and I ordered a hot dog and a Coke, and I remember that so vividly. So I know that was a big thing where all of a sudden I could pick what I wanted to eat. I didn't have to just eat what was given to me at the mess hall.
What kind of food was given to you at the mess hall?
At lot of hot dogs and macaroni. But later, as the Japanese people we grew vegetables and fruits, and we raised, the government made it so that we could raise our own chickens and pigs, and so we had a decent diet. I didn't. I was a picky eater, so I didn't care.
I don't know, picky. I mean, living on macaroni and hot dogs is not very healthy, so I think being picky is a good thing. If you want to survive, you should eat well. And how long were you in the camp for?
Oh, yes. My family was in the camp for all 3.5 years. But like my husband's family, my husband's father joined the 442. So he was translating documents in Washington, D.C. from Japanese to English. And so his family was able to move out to Chicago. And he was in Chicago during part of the time then. My older sister got a scholarship to a small college in Kansas. She was able to leave the camp and make use of that scholarship. So different people left the camps for different reasons, but my family happened to stay in the camp.
Tell me,
Mikhail, are you familiar with the 442nd?
No, I was actually going to ask, that was one of my 5 questions that I have in front of me now.
Okay,
Tell me,
Gordon
please do.
That.
So the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was a segregated military unit where the enlisted men were all Japanese Americans and the officers were white. That did change over time, but it started out as a military unit so that the Army could take advantage of young Japanese American volunteers. And a number of them did volunteer out of the camps. A large number also volunteered from Hawaii, where in Hawaii there was only one small internment camp, so very few Japanese in Hawaii were actually interned. And the 442nd fought in Europe very bravely, went on to become recipients of a Congressional Gold Medal for valor.
So it was a way to, in a different way to help, supposedly help America while kind of getting out of the concentration camp, right? By being in the...
It was a way to show patriotism to our country.
Got it.
To help pave the way for getting people released from the camps and then having them be more accepted when they were released from the camps.
A question, thank you for telling me about the 442. 442, now what is that? Is that like an Army code, or how do you classify 442?
That's a good question. I actually don't know how the number came to be. I'm sorry.
I think all the regiments have their numbers, and theirs happened to be 442.
Yoshiko, you stated that you heard people have said to you, go back to your country. How many times while living in the United States did you hear similar things?
I personally have only heard it a couple times, but I know my feelings can often be hurt because people will talk about all these immigrants coming here and, oh my gosh, we're going to be the minority now. And they're my white friends. I mean, they're my friends. I think they almost forget that I'm not white when we're just together in a social group. So I feel like there is that feeling against Japanese yet, and Asians.
And many minorities and many people from many different countries. Absolutely, I can attest to that as well. Absolutely. What about books? Now that you're sharing your story, both Yoshiko and Gordon, have either of you written a book or are planning to, or can you suggest some excellent books on the subject from people who have experienced this, like yourself?
Yes, there is a whole list of books. I've written a few stories. I'm taking a creative writing class, so I sometimes write a story. like about my father-in-law, who joined the military intelligence service and translated those documents. So slowly people were writing about it, and I just heard that there's a new book written by the man who wrote Three Boys in a Boat, or The Boys in the Boat, and now he has written a story about the Japanese who joined the 442, and that should be a very powerful book. Gordon, do you have comments on that?
Well, there are literally hundreds of books that have been written on the internment. Mm-hmm. But the one that I'm reading right now, you can see it here.
Let me read it to the audience. Please hold it up again. It's called The Eagles of Heart Mountain. Yes. So I understand that there's many books. I wanted to ask you, since you're the lead docent, what are the top, 2-3 books that, people should go to, that these are the books that share the valuable experiences and are really the best books on the subject from your view?
Okay. Can you see this book?
Years of Infamy.
Infamy by Michi Wegland. And this was one of the first books that came out that proved that the Japanese who lived here were not a threat to the United States. She goes into historical papers to come up with those conclusions. And then this is also one of my favorite books that I often give to my friends.
What is it called?
Manzanar, which is the name of one of the camps.
I see.
Camp in California. And this book has beautiful photographs by Ansel Adams.
Okay.
And he was one of the professional photographers who was invited to go into the camp and take pictures. We couldn't take cameras with us, and so it's so nice to have someone like Ansel Adams taking pictures of the camp.
So while you were in the camp, you had did you have any ability to communicate with the external world? Could you make phone calls? Could you write letters? And could you take photographs? Could you express yourself?
Later we could take photographs, so I do have a few photographs of myself in the camp. And I wrote to my first grade teacher when I was in the camp, and she wrote back to me, and my mother saved that letter for me. So I have that as one of my belongings.
That's precious. And what about, let's say you needed to make a phone call to someone. Could you?
I don't believe so. I don't remember talking. I just don't think we had phones for everybody.
I guess I just wanted to know if there was respect given for your expression at the time, or was it like, sit here, be quiet until we know that we're okay and then you can leave. What I'm trying to understand also is, was there a level of respect that you're human, that you should express yourself within these boundaries where you're stuck?
Okay, Franklin Roosevelt, as Gordon said, was the one who signed Executive Order 9066 that put us in the camp. After a year and a half or 2 years, the leaders in Europe were saying, "What are you doing? You're doing what Hitler is
Exactly.
doing." And he felt a little pressure of, well, maybe it shouldn't be that way. He asked Eleanor Roosevelt to go to the camps and check it out. And she came to the camp I was in, Gila, because our camp had not had any problems with riots or uprisings or anything. So she came to our camp, and she was amazed at how we had built up a little community. And she wrote an article in Collier's magazine and she talked about how we don't have one race in this country, but we have to show respect, have respect for all people of all races. And when I think of her saying that in 1943 or 4, I think it's so true today too. That I always talk to students about that.
So was Eleanor Roosevelt's article and visitation the reason for kind of the end of the concentration camps, do you think?
It possibly could have led to that.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, and then Gordon, if you could briefly kind of share with people about the museum so they can come and visit, come and support you, your website. How can people support the cause, and what can they find there? When is it open?
So, well, currently we're not open to visitors because of the pandemic. We hope to open within the next month. However, they can visit us on the internet. It's www.jamsj.org, www.jamsj.org. Our mission is we collect, preserve, and share Japanese American history, culture, arts, with an emphasis on the greater San Francisco Bay Area. We have 4 primary galleries. One, we talk about the San Jose Japantown area, so a lot of discussion about how that came to be. We also talk about the immigration of not just Japanese Americans, but also other Asian Americans to the United States. We have an exhibit on farming in the area we live in here. It's called the Santa Clara Valley, and the importance of farming to Japanese immigrants. And then, of course, the main part of our museum is dedicated to telling the story of the internment.
That's very powerful. And if people would like to donate to the cause, is it through your website?
Yes, just go to our website. You can donate. And there's one other website that I'd like to mention.
Sure.
There's an organization in Seattle called DENSHO, DENSHO. So if you go to densho.org, it's an internet-only organization, but it's dedicated to preserving the history of the internment. There is a wealth of information you can find at that website, and it also includes some very nice summaries of the internment.
There's something I'd like. Thank you for sharing that information with the audience. When I speak to just kind of random people in conversation, and I bring up this history, there's this consensus of brushing it off and saying, well, we were afraid. We had to just do it. It's this mentality that I hear. It's this kind of scapegoating, this kind of, it's okay that it happened, it's over, and we don't want to talk about it. And I just want to understand from your perspective, that is so kind of polluted, because in a way it's like brushing it off, and it's a very important part of the psychology of the way that people treat each other here, which is, which leads to a lot of problems. So my question to you is, what would be the way that you could communicate to the people who brush this off and explain to them that this is not just a one-time occurrence, this is a pattern, and this is something that must be looked at into the root, so that the respect for people and the fear of those that are misunderstood does not lead to this kind of stuff in the future?
The one thing that I used to get when I spoke about the internment was, well, look what the Japanese soldiers did to the American soldiers. And at one time, I didn't want to respond to that. I would just go on to the next subject. But now, today, finally, I'm able to say, yes, that was the Japanese government who did that. It had nothing to do with me. And I think people need to understand that just because we have a Japanese face, we are still Americans, just like you are.
Beautiful. Beautifully put. Gordon, do you have any words on that?
Unfortunately, I think it's been a pattern throughout all of humanity, which is that we look at people's racial characteristics or their religions or political beliefs, and in difficult situations, we then become fearful of everybody that we believe are part of that group, without looking at people as individuals, without understanding that just because you're part of some group, it doesn't mean we all think alike. And so I hope it's education, I hope it's tolerance, I hope it's activities that are going on today that eventually will cause us to change that mindset.
That's beautiful. I completely agree with both, and I find that very valuable for the audience to hear and learn, and hopefully patterns will change in the future, and fear will not create such pain for people. I thank both of you for being on the show, and it was a really powerful show, very both inspirational for the future and educational of the past. And Yoshiko, I really do hope that some of your creative writing or historically creative writing will come out soon, so that we can all read it. And your positivity is inspirational, and Gordon, the fact that you're rooted into educating this cause is really a beautiful thing. So I thank both of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the interview.